The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training grounds of Fort Marshall, one of the most prestigious military academies in the country. The air was thick with tension and the sound of boots marching in perfect rhythm. Among the sea of perfectly pressed uniforms and stern faces, a figure stood out like a sore thumb. Sarah Martinez adjusted her newly issued uniform one more time, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to appear calm. At 19, she was younger than most of the recruits around her, and her petite frame made her look even smaller among the towering soldiers who surrounded her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, but a few stubborn strands had already escaped, framing her nervous face. The other soldiers had been watching her since she arrived 3 days ago. Whispers followed her everywhere she went, and not the kind that welcomed newcomers. She could feel their eyes on her now as she stood in formation, waiting for the morning briefing to begin. "Look at her," muttered Corporal Jake Stevens to his friend beside him. "Daddy probably bought her way in here, but she's never seen a real day of combat in her life." His companion, Private Tom Wilson, snickered quietly. "Give her a week. She'll be crying and running home to mommy. These rich kids never last long when things get real." Sarah heard every word, but she kept her eyes forward, her jaw clenched tight. She had heard similar comments countless times over the past few days, and each one stung more than the last. The assumption that she didn't belong here, that she was some spoiled rich girl playing soldier, cut deep because it was so far from the truth. The truth was that Sarah had fought harder than anyone to be here. She had grown up in a small apartment with her grandmother, Maria Martinez, who had raised her after her parents disappeared when she was just 7 years old. Her grandmother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. There had been no trust fund, no wealthy father pulling strings. Sarah had earned her place here through scholarships, perfect grades, and more determination than most people twice her age possessed. But looking around at the suspicious faces surrounding her, Sarah knew that explaining her background wouldn't make any difference. These soldiers had already made up their minds about who she was and why she was here. All she could do was prove them wrong through her actions. Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez stepped up to address the formation, his voice booming across the training ground. "Listen up, recruits. Today we're starting advanced combat training. This isn't the playground anymore. Some of you might think you know what you're doing because you've watched a few war movies or played some video games. Let me tell you something. This is the real deal." His eyes swept across the formation, lingering for a moment on Sarah. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away even though her heart was pounding. "We got a new addition to our unit," Sergeant Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. Martinez stepped forward. Sarah's stomach dropped, but she obeyed immediately, taking 3 sharp steps forward and snapping to attention. She could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her back, and the weight of their judgment felt heavier than any equipment she might be asked to carry. "This is Private Martinez," the sergeant announced. "She's here to prove she belongs with the rest of you. Some of you might have questions about how she got here. I don't care about questions. I care about performance. Martinez, you'll be partnered with Corporal Stevens for today's exercises." Jake Stevens stepped forward with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah could see the challenge written all over his face, and she knew this wasn't going to be a fair partnership. Stevens was known throughout the unit as one of the toughest soldiers, someone who didn't go easy on anyone, especially not on people he thought didn't deserve to be there. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nerves churning in her stomach. The morning exercises began with a 5-mile run in full gear. Sarah had always been a strong runner, but the added weight of her pack and the brutal pace set by Stevens tested every limit she thought she had. He kept pushing faster, clearly trying to break her down early. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but she refused to fall behind. "Come on, princess," Stevens called back to her, as they crested a particularly steep hill. "Is this too hard for you? Maybe you should ask Daddy to get you transferred to a desk job." Sarah didn't waste breath responding. She focused on matching his stride, on controlling her breathing, on proving that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. By the time they finished the run, she was exhausted but still standing. Several other recruits had fallen behind, but she had kept pace with Stevens the entire way. The physical training continued with obstacle courses, rope climbing, and combat drills. Each exercise seemed designed to push her to her breaking point, and Stevens made sure to add his own special brand of psychological warfare along the way. "Watch this," he said loudly enough for others to hear as Sarah approached the rope climb. "Bet you $20 she doesn't make it halfway up." Private Wilson laughed. "I'll take that bet. Look at those tiny arms. She's got no upper body strength at all." Sarah grabbed the rope without a word and began to climb. Her shoulders screamed in protest, and her hands quickly became raw from the rough hemp, but she kept going, one hand over the other, pulling herself up inch by inch. The jeers and comments from below faded away as she focused entirely on reaching the top. When she finally rang the bell at the summit, the training ground had gone quiet. She rappelled down quickly and professionally, landing lightly on her feet. Stevens was staring at her with a mixture of surprise and annoyance, clearly not expecting her to complete the challenge so easily. "Lucky," he muttered, but there was less conviction in his voice now. The day continued with weapons training, where Sarah's accuracy with both rifle and pistol surprised even Sergeant Rodriguez. She had learned to shoot from her grandmother, who had served briefly in the military before Sarah's grandfather was born. Those weekend trips to the shooting range have been some of Sarah's happiest childhood memories, and the skills she learned there serve her well now. "Not bad, Martinez," the sergeant admitted grudgingly after watching her put 10 shots in a tight grouping at the center of the target. "Not bad at all." But the other soldiers weren't ready to give up their assumptions so easily. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself sitting alone at a table in the mess hall. Conversations stopped when she walked by, and she could feel the weight of constant scrutiny. "I heard she cheated on the entrance exams," someone whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "No way someone like that could have earned her way in legitimately." "My buddy in administration says her file is classified," another voice added. "That's not normal for a regular recruit. There's definitely something fishy going on." Sarah forced herself to eat, even though her appetite had disappeared. She had always known that military life would be challenging, but she hadn't expected the social isolation to be as difficult as the physical demands. Every day felt like she was fighting a war on multiple fronts, proving herself physically while also battling the constant assumption that she didn't deserve to be there. The afternoon brought more combat training, this time focusing on hand-to-hand combat techniques. Sarah had some experience from self-defense classes she had taken in college, but she knew this would be different. The moves they were learning here were designed for real combat situations, not for escaping from muggers in parking lots. Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated several holds and throws, then ordered the recruits to pair up and practice. Predictably, Sarah found herself paired with Stevens again, and his grin told her that he was looking forward to this particular exercise. "Try not to cry when I throw you around, princess," he said as they faced off on the practice mat. "I promise I'll try to be gentle." Sarah settled into a defensive stance, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. She had learned long ago that size wasn't everything in a fight. Technique, timing, and determination could overcome a lot of physical disadvantages. Stevens came at her hard and fast, clearly intending to end the match quickly and embarrass her in front of everyone. But Sarah had been expecting his aggressive approach. She sidestepped his charge, used his own momentum against him, and sent him sprawling onto the mat with a perfectly executed hip throw. The training ground went dead silent. Stevens lay on his back, staring up at the sky with a look of complete shock on his face. Sarah extended her hand to help him up, but he slapped it away and scrambled to his feet on his own. "Lucky shot," he growled, but his face was flushed with embarrassment. Again, Sergeant Rodriguez called out, clearly interested to see if Sarah's success had been a fluke. This time Stevens was more cautious, but also more angry. He approached with better technique, trying to use his size and strength advantage to overpower her. They grappled for several minutes, neither able to gain a clear advantage. Sarah's smaller size allowed her to slip out of holds that would have trapped larger opponents, while Steven's strength made it difficult for her to execute the throws she wanted. Finally, Sarah saw her opening. Stevens overcommitted to a takedown attempt, and she managed to slip behind him and apply a textbook rear chokehold. Within seconds, he was forced to tap out or risk losing consciousness. The silence that followed was even more complete than before. Sarah released the hold immediately and stepped back, offering her hand again. This time, Stevens took it, though he didn't look happy about it. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked, his tone more respectful than it had been all day. "My grandmother taught me some basics," Sarah replied, "and I took martial art classes in college. But mostly I just try to pay attention to your demonstration, sir." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Well, you were definitely paying attention. That was textbook execution." As the day's training came to an end, Sarah could feel that something had shifted. The whispers hadn't stopped completely, but they were different now. Instead of dismissive assumptions about her incompetence, she heard grudging acknowledgement of her skills. "Did you see how fast she moved? That throw was perfect. Stevens never saw it coming. Maybe there's more to her than we thought." But not everyone was ready to change their opinion. As Sarah was cleaning her equipment after the day's exercises, she overheard a conversation between several of the more vocal critics. "So what if she can fight a little?" Private Wilson was saying. "That doesn't prove anything. Rich kids can afford the best trainers money can buy. I bet she's been taking private lessons her whole life." "Exactly," agreed another soldier. "This is all just an act. Wait until we get into a real situation, something she can't have prepared for. Then we'll see what she's really made of." Corporal Stevens, still smarting from his defeats on the training mat, nodded emphatically. "She got lucky today, that's all. But luck runs out eventually. When things get real, when bullets start flying, that's when you see who belongs here and who doesn't." Sarah pretended not to hear, but their words stung nonetheless. No matter what she accomplished, it seemed like there would always be someone ready to dismiss her achievements as luck, or cheating, or the result of some unfair advantage. She was beginning to wonder if she would ever be able to truly prove herself to these people. That evening, she called her grandmother from the payphone outside the barracks. Maria Martinez's warm voice was like a balm to Sarah's wounded spirit. "How are you doing, Mija?" her grandmother asked in her accented English. "Are they treating you well there?" Sarah hesitated, not wanting to worry the woman who had already sacrificed so much for her. "It's challenging, Abuela, but I'm managing. I know you are, Mija. You are stronger than you know. Stronger than they know, too, I think. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake coming here," Sarah admitted. "Maybe I don't belong with these people." There was a long pause before her grandmother spoke again. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. You belong wherever you choose to belong. Those people, they don't know your story. They don't know what you've overcome, what you've sacrificed to be there. But, you know, and that's what matters. I just wish I could make them understand. Understanding comes with time, Mija. Some people, they need to see the same thing many times before they believe it. But you don't give up, okay? You show them who you are every single day until they have no choice but to see the truth." After hanging up the phone, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. Her grandmother was right. She had overcome too much to give up now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself. And she would be ready for whatever came her way. As she walked back to the barracks, she noticed a figure sitting on the steps outside the building. It was Private Lisa Chun, one of the few soldiers who hadn't actively participated in the harassment Sarah had been facing. "Hey," Lisa said quietly as Sarah approached. "You did good out there today." Sarah paused, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Thanks. That means a lot. Don't let those guys get to you," Lisa continued. "They do this to everyone who's different, everyone who threatens their little boys' club. I went through the same thing when I first got here." "How'd you get through it?" Lisa smiled. "Same way you are. One day at a time, one challenge at a time. Eventually, they either accept you or they transfer out. Either way, you win." That night, as Sarah lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of the barracks settling around her, she thought about everything that had happened. The physical challenges had been difficult, but she had met them all successfully. The real challenge was psychological, overcoming the constant doubt and suspicion of her fellow soldiers. But she was her grandmother's granddaughter, and Maria Martinez had taught her never to back down from a fight, especially when she knew she was right. Whatever tomorrow brought, Sarah would be ready. She would continue to prove herself, one challenge at a time, until even her harshest critics had to acknowledge that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Sarah Martinez had never been afraid of hard work. And she wasn't about to start now. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Martinez first arrived at Fort Marshall. And while she had managed to prove her physical capabilities, the social warfare continued unabated. If anything, her early successes had made some of her fellow soldiers even more determined to find fault with her presence. They couldn't question her shooting accuracy anymore, or her ability to complete obstacle courses, but they found other ways to make her life difficult. The morning started like any other, with Sarah waking before dawn to prepare for another day of training. She had developed a routine of getting up 30 minutes earlier than required, giving herself time to mentally prepare for whatever challenges and insults the day might bring. As she made her way to the communal showers, she discovered the first sign that today would be different from the others. Someone had filled her shampoo bottle with honey. Sarah stared at the sticky mess in her palm, her jaw tightening with controlled anger. This wasn't just pranking. This was sabotage designed to make her late for morning formation. She could hear muffled laughter from one of the stalls, confirming that this had been planned and that someone was waiting to see her reaction. She quickly rinsed her hands and hair as best she could with just water, knowing that being late would give her critics more ammunition against her. As she hurried back to her bunk to change into her uniform, she found another unpleasant surprise waiting for her. Her boots had been filled with shaving cream. Sarah's hands shook with frustration as she cleaned out her boots, precious minutes ticking away. She could hear the whispers and snickers from other soldiers who were obviously in on the joke. By the time she had cleaned everything up and gotten dressed, she had barely 2 minutes to get to formation. She ran across the base, her still damp hair coming loose from its bun, arriving just as Sergeant Rodriguez was calling the unit to attention. Her breathless arrival and disheveled appearance drew exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. "Martinez," Sergeant Rodriguez barked. "Care to explain why you look like you just rolled out of bed?" Before Sarah could respond, Corporal Stevens spoke up. "Probably having trouble adjusting to military life, Sergeant. Some people just aren't cut out for the discipline required." A wave of barely contained laughter rippled through the formation. Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation, but she forced herself to stand at attention and accept the reprimand she knew was coming. "Drop and give me 50, Martinez," the sergeant ordered. "Maybe that will help you remember what time formation begins." Sarah dropped to the ground without protest and began her push-ups. As she counted off each repetition, she could hear the whispered comments from the soldiers around her. "Guess the princess isn't used to waking up early. Probably stayed up all night crying daddy on the phone. I heard she's got a private room because she's too good to bunk with the rest of us." That last comment wasn't true. Sarah shared a room with 3 other soldiers, just like everyone else. But truth had never been a requirement for the rumors that followed her around the base. Each false assumption built upon the last, until she had been transformed in their minds into some sort of spoiled rich girl who was only there because of connections rather than merit. The morning training exercise was a field navigation course that would test their ability to read maps, use compasses, and find their way through unfamiliar terrain under time pressure. The soldiers were divided into pairs, and once again Sarah found herself partnered with someone who made no secret of his hostility toward her. This time, it was Private Rick Morrison, a stocky soldier from Texas who had been one of the most vocal critics of her presence at Fort Marshall. Morrison had been telling anyone who would listen that women didn't belong in combat roles, and Sarah's arrival had given him a perfect target for his prejudices. Well, Morrison drawled as they received their navigation equipment. Looks like I got stuck babysitting the base princess. Try to keep up, sweetheart. This isn't a shopping mall. You can't just ask for directions to the nearest Starbucks. Sarah checked their compass and studied the map, ignoring his taunts. The course was designed to take them through some of the most challenging terrain on the base, including dense woods, rocky hills, and a swampy area that would test both their navigation skills and their physical endurance. The first checkpoint is approximately 2 miles northeast, she said, pointing to their destination on the map. If we maintain a steady pace and stick to the ridge line, we should be able to avoid most of the swamp. Morrison snatched the map away from her. I'll handle the navigation, princess. You just try not to slow me down too much. Sarah bit back her response and followed as Morrison led them in what she immediately recognized as the wrong direction. She tried to point out his error, but he dismissed her concerns with increasing irritation. I've been reading maps since I was 10 years old, he snapped. I don't need some college girl telling me how to find my way through the woods. 20 minutes later, they were standing knee-deep in swamp water, completely lost. Morrison stared at the compass with growing confusion, turning it in different directions as if that would somehow change their location. This compass must be broken, he muttered. Sarah waited for him to ask for her help, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that he needed assistance from someone he considered inferior. Instead, he continued to lead them deeper into the swamp, their boots making sucking sounds in the thick mud with each step. By the time Morrison finally swallowed his pride and handed her the map, they were over an hour behind schedule and completely soaked in muddy swamp water. Sarah quickly determined their position and plotted a course to the first checkpoint, but she knew they had lost too much time to compete effectively with the other teams. Don't say a word, Morrison warned as they finally reached the checkpoint. Not one word about what happened out there. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure why she was protecting someone who had been making her life miserable. Maybe it was because she understood what it felt like to be humiliated in front of the entire unit, or maybe she just didn't want to give the other soldiers more reason to resent her presence. But word spread anyway. Other teams had seen them stumbling around in the swamp, and by the time they returned to base, everyone knew that Morrison had gotten them lost. The twist that made it through the rumor mill, however, was that Sarah had been the one to navigate them into the swamp in the first place. Did you hear about Martinez and Morrison? She heard someone saying in the mess hall that evening. She got them so lost they spent half the day wandering around in circles. Morrison tried to fix her mistakes, but it was too late. Sarah sat alone at her usual table, eating her meal in silence while listening to her reputation being destroyed one whisper at a time. She had given Morrison a chance to tell the truth about what had happened, but he had chosen instead to let her take the blame. The betrayal stung more than she wanted to admit. Private Lisa Chun sat down across from her with her dinner tray. Rough day. You could say that, Sarah replied, grateful for even this small gesture of friendship. For what it's worth, I don't believe what they're saying about the navigation exercise. Morrison's been bragging for months about his woodsman skills, and suddenly he can't find his way out of a paper bag. That doesn't add up. Sarah looked up in surprise. You don't think I got us lost? Lisa laughed. Please, I've seen you work. You're the most detail-oriented person in this entire unit. There's no way you would make that kind of basic navigation error. It was a small thing, but having at least one person believe in her competence meant more to Sarah than she could express. She was beginning to realize that the isolation was affecting her more deeply than she had anticipated. The constant doubt and criticism were wearing her down in ways that the physical challenges never could. The next few days brought more of the same treatment. Someone loosened the bolts on her rifle during weapons maintenance, causing it to malfunction during firing practice. Her mail was mysteriously delayed, causing her to miss an important package from her grandmother. Small items from her locker kept disappearing, nothing valuable enough to warrant an official investigation, but enough to make her daily life more difficult. The breaking point came during a night training exercise designed to simulate combat conditions. The soldiers were divided into two teams and given paintball weapons for a mock battle in the woods surrounding the base. Sarah found herself assigned to a squad led by Corporal Stevens, who made it clear that he expected her to be more of a liability than an asset. "Martinez, you stick close to me," Stevens ordered as they prepared to move out. "When the shooting starts, I don't want you wandering off and getting yourself killed. Bad enough we have to babysit you without having to explain to your rich daddy why his little princess got hurt playing soldier." Sarah gritted her teeth, but nodded. She had learned that arguing would only make things worse, and she was determined to prove her worth through actions rather than words. The exercise began at sunset, with each team trying to capture the other's flag while defending their own position. Sarah's team was tasked with infiltrating the enemy base, a temporary structure set up in a clearing about a mile from their starting position. As they moved through the darkening forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The other members of her squad seemed unusually tense, and she caught several of them exchanging meaningful looks when they thought she wasn't watching. Her suspicions were confirmed when they reached a small clearing about halfway to their objective. Stevens called for a halt and gathered the squad for what he claimed was a tactical briefing. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Change of plans. Martinez, you're going to create a distraction by approaching the enemy position from the east. Draw their fire and keep them busy while the rest of us circle around from the west." Sarah studied the terrain on her map, frowning. "Sir, that approach would put me in an exposed position with no cover and no backup. If this were a real combat situation, it would be a suicide mission." "Good thing this isn't a real combat situation, then," Stevens replied with a cold smile. "It's just paint, Martinez. Unless you're too scared to take a little risk for your team." The challenge was clear, and Sarah knew that refusing would only confirm their belief that she didn't belong there. But she also recognized that Stevens was setting her up to fail, possibly even to get hurt. The eastern approach he was suggesting would take her through terrain she wasn't familiar with, in the dark, with no support from her teammates. "I understand the plan, sir," she said finally, "but I think it would be more effective if we worked as a team. I could provide overwatch while you and the others make the approach, or we could use a pincer movement to—" "Are you questioning my orders, Martinez?" Stevens interrupted, his voice rising. "Because it sounds like you think you know better than your squad leader." The other soldiers were watching the confrontation with obvious interest, waiting to see how Sarah would respond. She realized that she was trapped between two bad choices: follow an order that seemed designed to humiliate or harm her, or refuse and confirm every negative assumption they had about her character. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I'll follow your orders." Stevens smiled triumphantly. "Outstanding. You move out in 5 minutes. Remember, your job is to be as loud and obvious as possible. Draw their attention and keep them busy." As Sarah prepared to leave the clearing, Private Wilson approached her with what appeared to be genuine concern on his face. "Hey, Martinez," he said in a low voice. "Maybe you should reconsider this. Stevens is sending you into a bad situation, and if something goes wrong—" Sarah looked at him suspiciously, wondering if this was another part of their psychological warfare. But Wilson seemed genuinely worried, and she found herself wondering if she had misjudged him. "I have my orders," she replied. "I'll be fine. Look, I know we haven't exactly been welcoming since you got here," Wilson continued, "but that doesn't mean we want to see you get seriously hurt. That terrain Stevens is sending you through, there are ravines out there, steep drops you can't see in the dark. And some of the guys on the other team, they play rough. Really rough." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe you should develop a sudden case of equipment failure," Wilson suggested. "Radio problems, weapon malfunction, whatever. Something that would give you an excuse to abort the mission." For a moment, Sarah was tempted. The smart thing to do would be to find a way out of this situation, to avoid whatever trap Stevens had set for her. But She also knew that taking Wilson's advice would be seen as proof that she couldn't handle the pressure, that she would look for any excuse to avoid dangerous assignments. "Thanks for the warning," she said finally, "but I'm going through with it." Wilson shook his head. "Your funeral." Sarah set out through the forest alone, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The night was darker than she had anticipated, with thick clouds blocking most of the moonlight. The terrain was exactly as difficult as Wilson had warned, full of hidden obstacles and treacherous footing. She moved as quietly as possible, using her compass and map to navigate toward the enemy position. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and every sound made her jump. This was nothing like the controlled training exercises she had participated in before. There was a sense of genuine danger in the air that she couldn't shake. As she approached the enemy base, Sarah could see lights and movement in the clearing ahead. She took position behind a fallen tree and studied the layout, looking for the best way to create the distraction Stevens had ordered without exposing herself unnecessarily. That's when she heard the voices behind her. "There she is," someone whispered, "right where Stevens said she'd be." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she had walked into a trap. This wasn't part of the training exercise. This was something else entirely. She turned slowly to see 3 figures emerging from the woods behind her, and even in the dim light, she could see that they weren't carrying paintball weapons. They were carrying real firearms. Sarah's mind raced as she faced the 3 figures emerging from the darkness, their weapons glinting in the faint moonlight. Her training kicked in automatically, assessing threats, calculating distances, looking for cover and escape routes. But something about the situation didn't add up. These weren't enemy soldiers from the exercise. Their uniforms were different, more professional, and their movement suggested a level of training that went beyond what she'd seen from most of the recruits at Fort Marshall. "Private Martinez," the lead figure said, his voice carrying an authority that demanded attention. "You need to come with us immediately." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, then stopped as she realized she was only carrying paintball equipment. "Who are you?" "This is supposed to be a training exercise." The man stepped closer, and Sarah could see more details in the dim light. He was older than the typical soldiers on base, maybe in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that suggested years of real combat experience. His uniform bore insignia she didn't recognize, but everything about him screamed special forces or intelligence. "There's no time to explain everything right now," he said urgently, "but you're in immediate danger. The exercise you think you're participating in, it's not what it appears to be." Sarah's mind reeled. "What are you talking about?" "Corporal Stevens sent me here to create a distraction while they flanked the enemy position." A look passed between the 3 men, and the leader shook his head grimly. "Private Martinez, Corporal Stevens isn't part of any sanctioned training exercise tonight. Neither are several other soldiers who've been targeting you since you arrived at this base." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The escalating harassment, the dangerous mission assignment, Wilson's warning about the terrain, and rough players. It hadn't been coincidence or hazing. It had been something far more sinister. "You're saying someone wants to hurt me?" Sarah asked, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were true. She had sensed the growing hostility around her, but she had attributed it to prejudice and jealousy rather than genuine malice. "More than hurt you," the second man said quietly. "Private Martinez, we need you to understand something. Your presence at Fort Marshall has created complications that go far beyond typical military training." "I don't understand. I'm just a recruit. I haven't done anything except try to prove I belong here." The leader studied her face in the moonlight. "You really don't know, do you? They kept you in the dark completely." "Know what?" Sarah demanded, her patience finally reaching its breaking point. "Who are you people? And what are you talking about?" "We're military intelligence," the man replied. "And as for what you need to know," he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Private Martinez, what do you know about your parents?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. My parents? They died when I was 7. Why would you ask about them? They didn't die, the man said quietly. They disappeared. There's a difference. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. What are you saying? Your parents, Captain Elena Martinez and Major David Shun, were military intelligence officers working on a classified operation 15 years ago. They uncovered information about a conspiracy within the military hierarchy. Officers were selling weapons to enemy forces, taking bribes, compromising national security for personal gain. Sarah stared at him in shock. That's impossible. My parents weren't military officers. My grandmother told me they were killed in a car accident. Your grandmother was protecting you. The third man spoke for the first time. After your parents discovered the conspiracy, they were targeted for elimination. They went into hiding to protect themselves and you, but the people they exposed had connections throughout the military establishment. Eventually, your parents decided that the only way to keep you safe was to fake their own deaths and disappear completely. The forest around Sarah seemed to spin. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, about why she was at Fort Marshall, none of it was true. If what you're saying is real, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, then why am I here? Why did I end up at a military academy if my parents were trying to keep me away from the military? Because the people your parents exposed are still out there, the leader explained. And when you applied to Fort Marshall under your mother's maiden name, someone made the connection. Your presence here isn't coincidence, Private Martinez. You were specifically assigned to this base because certain people wanted you where they could keep an eye on you. The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. The harassment, the escalating incidents, it wasn't just prejudice, was it? Some of it was genuine prejudice, the man admitted. But it was being encouraged and directed by people who had larger plans for you. Tonight's exercise was supposed to be the culmination of those plans. They were going to make it look like an accident during training. Sarah thought about Stephen's insistence on sending her alone into dangerous terrain, about Wilson's warning, about all the small sabotages and humiliations that had been building up over the past few weeks. It had all been leading to this moment. But you stopped it, she said. We've been watching you since the day you arrived, the leader confirmed. We suspected something was wrong when we saw the pattern of harassment, but we didn't understand the full scope until tonight. When we realized what Stevens and his people were planning, we had to intervene. Stevens is part of the conspiracy. Stevens is a low-level player, probably doesn't even know the full picture. He's been taking orders from someone higher up the chain, someone who told him you were a security risk that needed to be eliminated quietly. Sarah's legs felt weak, and she leaned against the fallen tree for support. This is insane. This can't be happening. I know it's a lot to process, the man said gently. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. The people who want you dead don't know we've intervened yet, but when you don't show up as planned, they're going to realize something went wrong. What about my grandmother? Is she safe? She's being protected, the second man assured her. We moved her to a secure location this afternoon. She's the one who finally contacted us and told us the truth about who you really are. She knew about all of this. She's known for years that this day might come. Your parents left instructions with her about what to do if you were ever in danger because of their past. She was hoping it would never be necessary, but when the reports about your treatment at Fort Marshall reached her through unofficial channels, she knew she had to act. The sound of voices in the distance interrupted their conversation. The training exercise was continuing around them, but Sarah now understood that there were multiple layers of activity happening simultaneously. Some soldiers were participating in a legitimate training exercise, while others were involved in something much more dangerous. We need to move, the leader said urgently. They'll be expecting radio contact from you soon, and when they don't get it, they'll come looking. As they prepared to leave, Sarah heard familiar voices approaching through the woods. Her blood ran cold as she recognized Stephen's voice, along with Wilson and several others. She should have made contact by now, Stevens was saying. Something's wrong. Maybe she got lost, Wilson suggested, but there was no conviction in his voice. Or maybe she figured out what was really happening, a third voice added. Sarah recognized it as Private Morrison, the soldier who had gotten them lost during the navigation exercise. The intelligence officers motioned for Sarah to remain quiet as the voices grew closer. Through the trees, she could see flashlight beams moving in their direction. "Martinez!" Stevens called out. "Martinez, report your position." When no answer came, Sarah heard Stevens curse under his breath. "Spread out and find her. And remember, this is a training accident." She got disoriented in the dark and fell into a ravine. These things happened during night exercises. Sarah felt sick as she heard her own death being planned so casually. These were people she had been training alongside, eating meals with, trying to prove herself to. And all along, they had been planning to kill her. The intelligence officers began moving silently through the forest, guiding Sarah away from the approaching search party. Their movement was professional and efficient, clearly the result of extensive training in covert operations. Sarah found herself impressed despite her fear. These were the kind of soldiers she had aspired to become. As they moved deeper into the woods, away from the base and the ongoing training exercise, Sarah's mind raced with questions. If my parents are still alive, where are they? Can I see them? The leader glanced back at her. That's complicated. They've been living under assumed identities for 15 years. Making contact with them would put all of you at risk until we can neutralize the people who have been hunting them. But it's possible. I might be able to see them again. If everything goes according to plan, yes. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. And we need to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy that your parents died trying to reveal. They reached a clearing where a helicopter was waiting, its rotors already spinning. Sarah had never been so happy to see an aircraft in her life. As they approached, two figures climbed out to meet them. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see that these weren't ordinary soldiers. Their bearing, their equipment, their obvious authority. These were high-ranking officers, the kind of people who made decisions that affected entire military operations. The first figure stepped forward, and Sarah's heart stopped. It was a woman, probably in her late 40s, with graying dark hair and features that seemed hauntingly familiar. She moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to command, but there was something in her eyes as she looked at Sarah, an emotion that had nothing to do with military protocol. "Private Martinez," the woman said, her voice carefully controlled. "I'm Colonel Rodriguez. We need to get you out of here immediately." But Sarah barely heard the words. She was staring at the woman's face, at features she recognized from old photographs her grandmother had shown her, at eyes that looked like her own. "Mom," she whispered. The woman's composed expression cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "Hello, Sarah. I'm so sorry we had to wait so long to bring you home." Sarah's knees buckled, and if the intelligence officer beside her hadn't caught her arm, she would have collapsed. Everything she thought she knew about the world had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. Her parents were alive. They were here, and they were military officers of obviously high rank and importance. The second figure stepped forward, and Sarah saw that it was a man with Asian features and graying hair, wearing the insignia of a general. Like the woman, he was struggling to maintain his military bearing while looking at Sarah with obvious emotion. "We don't have time for a full reunion right now," he said gently. "But, Sarah, I'm General Chun, your father, and we're going to make sure you're safe no matter what it takes." Sarah looked back and forth between these two people who were supposed to be her parents, who had been dead for most of her life, who were now standing before her as high-ranking military officers. The questions came tumbling out of her mouth faster than she could organize them. "Where have you been? Why didn't you contact me? How long have you known I was at Fort Marshall? Is my grandmother really safe? What's going to happen to me now?" "All of those questions have answers," Colonel Rodriguez, her mother, said softly. "But right now, we need to focus on keeping you alive. The people who have been trying to kill you don't know we're here yet, but that won't last long. We need to extract you from this situation before they realize what's happened." As they moved toward the helicopter, Sarah caught a glimpse of other figures in the aircraft. more high-ranking officers, all watching her with expressions of respect and concern that was completely different from anything she had experienced at Fort Marshall. "Who are all these people?" she asked as they climbed aboard. Her father, the general, smiled grimly. "These are the people your parents have been working with for the past 15 years to root out the corruption your original investigation exposed. It's taken us this long to build a case strong enough to act on, and having you in danger accelerated our timeline considerably." The helicopter lifted off, carrying Sarah away from Fort Marshall and toward a future she couldn't have imagined just hours earlier. As the base grew smaller below them, she realized that her struggle to prove herself worthy of respect had been more successful than she had ever imagined. She had earned the attention of generals. The helicopter touched down at a secure military facility that Sarah didn't recognize, somewhere far from Fort Marshall. The building looked more like a corporate headquarters than a military base, with modern architecture and high-tech security systems that spoke of serious government funding and classified operations. As they walked through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished military officers, Sarah tried to process everything that had happened. Just hours ago, she had been a struggling recruit trying to prove herself worthy of basic respect from her fellow soldiers. Now she was walking alongside generals and colonels who treated her as if she were someone of vital importance. "I still don't understand," she said as they entered a conference room with panoramic windows overlooking the surrounding countryside. "If you're both high-ranking officers, if you've been alive all this time, why was I living with my grandmother in a tiny apartment? Why was I working 3 jobs to pay for college? Why did I need scholarships to afford military academy?" Her mother, Colonel Rodriguez, took a seat across from her, and Sarah could see the pain in her eyes. "Because we couldn't risk any connection to you that might lead our enemies to discover you were still alive. As far as the corrupt officers we were investigating knew, our entire family died in that car accident 15 years ago. Any financial support, any contact, any acknowledgement of your existence would have put you in immediate danger. But it was torture," her father, General Chun, added quietly. "Watching you struggle, seeing you work so hard for things that should have been yours by birthright, knowing we could help but couldn't risk it. Your grandmother sent us updates, pictures, report cards. We knew about every achievement, every challenge, every moment of your life." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "So why I decided to join the military, you knew?" "We knew. And we were terrified," her mother admitted. "We tried to influence your assignment, to get you sent somewhere safe, but the people we were investigating still had enough influence to override our efforts. They made sure you ended up at Fort Marshall, where they could keep an eye on you, and eventually eliminate me when they decided I was too much of a risk," Sarah said, the full horror of the situation finally sinking in. General Chun nodded grimly. "They were patient, I'll give them that. They spent weeks building up psychological pressure, creating an environment where your death could look like suicide or accident. If we hadn't intervened when we did." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood exactly how close she had come to dying without ever knowing who she really was or why she was being targeted. "So what happens now?" she asked. Before anyone could answer, the conference room door opened and 3 more figures entered. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw their insignia. These were not just generals, but the highest-ranking military officers in the country. She started to stand, but General Chun motioned for her to remain seated. "Sarah," her mother said formally, "I'd like you to meet General Patterson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Williams, Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Thompson, Chief of Naval Operations." The 3 officers took seats around the conference table, and Sarah felt overwhelmed by the level of authority represented in the room. These were people who made decisions that affected the entire military, who advised the president on matters of national security. "Private Martinez," General Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command, "what you've been through over the past few weeks represents a failure of our system that goes far beyond what any soldier should have to endure. But I want you to understand something. Your conduct during this ordeal has been observed, and evaluated by people far beyond your immediate superiors. Sarah looked around the table in confusion. Sir, Admiral Thompson leaned forward. Every challenge you faced at Fort Marshall, every test of your character and abilities, some of it was orchestrated by people who wanted to harm you, but much of it was genuine evaluation by officers who were trying to assess your potential. I don't understand, Sarah said. Potential for what? Her father smiled for the first time since she had seen him. Sarah, your performance over the past few weeks has been extraordinary. Your physical capabilities, your mental toughness, your ability to maintain discipline and focus under extreme psychological pressure. These are exactly the qualities we look for in our most elite units. General Williams opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. Your scores on every evaluation, your performance in combat training, your leadership potential as observed by independent assessors. Everything indicates that you have the potential for a military career at the very highest levels. Sarah stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Charts, graphs, evaluation reports, all bearing her name and containing assessments that were far more positive than anything she had heard during her time at Fort Marshall. But the other soldiers, the harassment, the constant criticism. She began. The harassment was real, and it was wrong, General Patterson said firmly. The officers responsible for allowing it to continue will face appropriate consequences. But the soldiers who were genuinely evaluating your performance saw something different than what you experienced day to day. Her mother pulled out another set of documents. Sarah, every instructor who worked with you submitted evaluation reports. Listen to this. Private Martinez demonstrates exceptional aptitude for combat operations. Her tactical thinking is sophisticated beyond her experience level, and her ability to perform under pressure is remarkable. That's from your weapons instructor. And this, her father added, reading from another report. Martinez shows natural leadership qualities and inspires confidence in others through her actions rather than her words. Despite facing significant social challenges, she has maintained the highest standards of military bearing. That's from Sergeant Rodriguez. Sarah felt her world shifting again. Sergeant Rodriguez wrote that, but he was always so critical of me. Because he was testing you, Admiral Thompson explained. The best leaders aren't created by praise and easy assignments. They're forged by pressure and challenge. Rodriguez was pushing you because he could see your potential, and he wanted to help you reach it. General Patterson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the countryside. Private Martinez, the corruption that your parents uncovered 15 years ago wasn't just about selling weapons or taking bribes. It was about systematically identifying and eliminating the most promising young officers before they could threaten the established power structure. The implications hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. You're saying they targeted me not just because of who my parents are, but because of who I might become? Exactly, her mother confirmed. The psychological harassment, the dangerous assignments, the attempts to break you down, part of it was personal vendetta against your parents, but part of it was recognition that you represented exactly the kind of leader they most feared. Sarah thought about all the times she had doubted herself, all the moments when she had wondered if she really belonged in the military. Now she was learning that her potential had been recognized by the highest levels of command, even as local officers were trying to destroy her. What does this mean for my future? She asked. General Williams smiled. It means you have choices that most soldiers never get offered. Your parents' investigation has finally provided us with enough evidence to arrest the corrupt officers and clean house throughout the military hierarchy. You could choose to continue your military career with a clean slate, knowing that the people who try to harm you will never be in a position to threaten anyone again. Or, Admiral Thompson added, you could choose to join the special operations community immediately. Your demonstrated abilities and your personal experience with military corruption make you uniquely qualified for certain assignments. Sarah looked around the table at these powerful officers who were treating her as an equal, offering her opportunities she had never dreamed possible. But one question still nagged at her. What about my grandmother? What about the life I built before all this happened? Her father reached across the table and took her hand. Maria Martinez is a remarkable woman who raised an exceptional daughter under impossible circumstances. She'll always be a part of your life, no matter what path you choose. As for the life you built, every scholarship you earned, every achievement you accomplished, every challenge you overcame, those were real, and they were yours. Nothing about this situation diminishes what you accomplished on your own. In fact, her mother added, those experiences probably made you stronger than you would have been if you had grown up with the privileges your birthright should have provided. The hardships you faced taught you lessons that can't be learned in classroom or training exercises. General Patterson returned to his seat and looked directly at Sarah. Private Martinez, I want to be very clear about something. What happened to you at Fort Marshall was wrong, and we failed in our duty to protect you from harassment and discrimination. But your response to those challenges has been exemplary, and every senior officer in this room believes you have the potential to achieve the highest ranks of military leadership. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to her. Just hours ago, she had been a struggling recruit facing death threats from fellow soldiers. Now she was being told that she had the potential to become a general herself someday. I need time to think about all of this, she said quietly. Of course, Admiral Thompson said. This is a life-changing decision, and you shouldn't make it lightly. Take all the time you need. But, General Williams added with a slight smile, I should mention that your first assignment, whatever you choose, comes with an immediate promotion to lieutenant. Your performance has already earned you advancement beyond the typical enlisted ranks. As the meeting concluded and the senior officers began to file out, Sarah's parents remained behind. For the first time in hours, she was alone with the people who had given her life but had been forced to disappear from it. I have so many questions, she said, tears finally beginning to fall freely. We have all the time in the world to answer them, her mother said, pulling her into a hug that had been 15 years in the making. We're never going to let anyone separate us again. Her father joined the embrace. And, for a moment, Sarah felt like the frightened 7-year-old who had lost her parents so many years ago. But she also felt the strength and confidence that had carried her through the past few weeks of hell at Fort Marshall. I think I want to continue my military career, she said, her voice muffled by her parents' uniforms. But I want to do it the right way, with honor and integrity. I want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. Then, you'll make an excellent officer, her father said proudly, and an even better leader. 3 months later, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood in formation at Fort Marshall, but this time she was wearing officer's insignia and addressing the same soldiers who had once tormented her. The corrupt officers had been arrested and court-martialed, and new leadership had been installed throughout the base. Listen up, soldiers, she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from having survived the worst the military could throw at her, and emerged stronger. I know some of you remember me from my time here as a recruit. I also know that some of you treated me poorly, and others stood by and let it happen. The formation was dead silent. Stevens, Morrison, Wilson, and the others who had participated in the harassment were no longer at Fort Marshall. They had been transferred or discharged as part of the investigation. But many of the soldiers who had witnessed the treatment were still there. I'm not here for revenge, Sarah continued. I'm here because this base needs to learn how to properly develop the potential in every soldier, regardless of their background, their gender, or their appearance. The military is stronger when we build each other up instead of tearing each other down. She paused and looked across the sea of faces, seeing some shame, some confusion, and hopefully some understanding. Some of you might be wondering how someone you saw as weak or unworthy ended up as your commanding officer. The answer is that I was never weak or unworthy. I just needed the chance to prove what I was capable of. Every one of you has that same potential inside you, and it's my job now to help you find it. As she dismissed the formation and watched the soldiers disperse, Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She had not only survived the crucible of Fort Marshall, but she had returned to transform it into the kind of place where excellence was nurtured rather than destroyed. Her grandmother had been right all along. She belonged wherever she chose to belong. And now, with 3 stars on each shoulder representing the generals who had recognized her worth, Sarah Martinez knew exactly where she belonged. She belonged in the fight to make the military better, one soldier at a time.